Welcome everyone to our 51st web debate. It's a pleasure to see you all for this debate in November. And the question we are asking this time is international organizations, independence under threat. I have two eminent speakers with me today, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the discussion with them. But allow me to share a couple of views on this topic from my perspective. So when we talk about international organizations, one of the framings we often use is to kind of distinguish between international organizations on the one hand as venues for states. So venues where states come and negotiate and develop agreements towards international cooperation. And then on the other hand, international organizations are actors in their own right. They are active, for example, in terms of implementation, but also active in terms of suggesting and putting new issues on the agenda. So from my perspective, they have these two very different roles, venue on the one side and actors on the other side. And I think this is something we will unpack a bit more as we get into the discussion today, which I'm really looking forward to. The other reason for putting this topic on the agenda is its timeliness. So when I speak of timeliness, when I talk about the independence of international organizations, one thing that comes to mind is the UN Secretary General. So the UN Secretary General Guterres has just been confirmed for a second term. And the role of the Secretary General is also a very interesting example of kind of discussing these two opposites, kind of on the one hand, as kind of a servant to member states, a civil servant in that sense. On the other hand, quite an independent role, at least in some interpretations. And then the other reason, or the other kind of timely reason why we wanted to ask this question and wanted to discuss the question is a recent critique that the World Bank faced. So basically the World Bank is facing a critique for alleged manipulation of data in one of their key reports, which is the Doing Business 2018 report. And again, here the question of independence comes to the fore. So to kind of unpack all of this and to kind of also give us a zoomed out view, I'm extremely happy to have two excellent speakers and two diplomats who are deeply related or also interested in the UN system. So let me quickly introduce them. We have with us Ambassador Petru Dumitriu. He's a Romanian diplomat, and his connection to the UN system, he has many connections to the UN system, but one that I want to highlight is that he joined the UN Joint Inspection Unit in 2016 as inspector. Petru also has a academic background. He wrote his PhD thesis on United Nations reform. And I think with these two roles as a practitioner, as a former practitioner, but also as with this kind of academic view on things, he will share some of his impressions and insights. And then we also welcome Ambassador Asoke Mukerji. And I'm really happy that he could join us as well. His diplomatic career spans 37 years and is also in some instances very closely related to the United Nations. He was India's ambassador and permanent representative to the UN in New York between 2013 and 2015. And here he played a role in negotiating the SDG agenda. So again, very interesting reflections, possibly from that perspective. Asoke is also a very active scholar, kind of sharing with his reflections on the rich past experience as a diplomat at the UN and elsewhere. So with that in mind, I want to get into the discussion. But before I start with my first question for them, I want to remind you, our audience, that we are trying to make this debate as interactive as possible. So as always, we're looking for your questions and your comments, which you can put here in the chat. And my colleague, Adriana Gavrilovic, will help me then to bring these comments and questions back into the discussion. So with all of that said, let us get into the discussion. And one of the main questions I want to start with, and I think we should start with, is basically this question about independence and freedom of maneuver for international organizations. And so the question I want to ask Petru and Asoke is, how much independence and freedom of maneuver should international organizations have in relation to states? Petru, why don't you start unraveling this question and some of the implications of
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kat. Thank you, colleagues, for the interest in the issue. I'm honored to be with you. I'm not sure if your complex questions and topic will be simplified, but what I would say, because my intention is to turn your question into three sub answers, and to have a yes and no and a maybe as a response. So somehow I will cover all possible options for a good answer. So as you anticipated, the first clarification should go in the sense that the United Nations and other intergovernmental organizations are by their essence the master of their own game. There are intergovernmental organizations, so they have the rights as described in the constitutions, be it in a different system, like one country, one vote in the United Nations, or a weighted system in the World Bank, but such organization as the United Nations cannot be independent from their member states. That is my no answer. The United Nations cannot be independent. It depends in all respects, decision-making, resources, plans of action, formulas of cooperation. It depends on the member states. The United Nations cannot do more than the member states allows it to do, or gives resources. So that is one aspect, one clarification. The other clarification is that you anticipated as the venue. There is the United Nations is not just the intergovernmental mechanism, it's also something else. If it is the venue, as you said, if it is a big convener, there is already a theory in that respect. The first United Nations is the intergovernmental machinery. The second United Nations is constituted by the Secretariat and its staff. Whether that is independent or not, my answer is yes. Both the Secretary General and the staff, they are obliged in terms of the Article 100 of the Charter to be independent and not to receive any sort of instruction from a specific government or a specific group of countries. I will take the liberty to quote this famous Article 100 of the Charter. It's good to look at it from time to time. In the performance of the duties of the Secretary General and his staff shall not seek or receive instruction from any government or from any other authority external to the organizations. They shall refrain from any action which might reflect on their position as international officials responsible only to the organizations. Each member of the United Nations undertakes to respect the exclusively international character of the responsibilities of the Secretary General. So legally speaking, in terms of what should be, obviously the United Nations is independent. Of course, there is a long discussion. We can start to look at the history of the United Nations to see to what extent some Secretary Generals managed to be indeed independent, or they paid the price if they wanted to be independent, or if they had to accept compromises. But I think the subject might be for another discussion. From that perspective, again, my answer is yes. Then the third clarification goes to maybe, and that probably relates very much to the case of the World Bank report, which was the pretext of this discussion. So so it's not the Secretary General that, like a poet, like a writer, writes report, do stuff. The United Nations and the staff, in many respects, they commission reports, and they use the reports produced by experts, by consultants, by consultancy company, etc., etc. Of course, the choice of the entities that write the reports is subjective. of course, the political aspect is almost always present. For instance, and Ambassador Mukerji will agree with me, there is no blue ribbon panel discussing the reform, or we had these famous reports produced on the responsibility to protect, on the peacekeeping, on the reform of the United Nations, and there is always a Russian, there is always an American, there is always an Indian for that matter, but that is not because India is a member of the Security Council, permanent member, but because of the weight India has in the whole system of multilateral diplomacy. So obviously, this is a subjective choice. So, and the reports of the organizations depend to some extent on the quality of the good intention and the competence and the integrity of those experts. But to do that, you know, I can assure you, being inside the United Nations for 5 years and writing myself reports, that there are many consecutive how to call them, defense wars against the corruption of the ideas, against distortion, against bias. And in most of the cases, these defense wars work very well. So I'd say, yes, maybe sometimes some reports, and you know very well the IPCC history with that case of one expert, a member of IPCC, who actually declared that the research he used, it was not actually uninfluenced, was not originally, there was an incident some 12 years ago on climate change. So this is the third thing that leads us to the idea that is also a maybe. But what I can say is that all measures against that sort of corruption is taken. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen that decisions are somehow biased or influenced by external power, by external forces, but it's not very frequent. What is new, and what I referred so far was maybe more or less the past. What is new is the influence of the big multinational companies. As you know, they have sometimes a bigger force than many states individual or all together. So it's not without reasoning that some people contested, for instance, challenged the role of Bill Gates Foundation in the work of the World Health organizations. There are some cases, but again, the World Health Organization in that case took so many measures and tried to be as transparent as possible to make sure that there is no undue influence on these organizations. And one last point on I went through myself to the report Doing Business 2018 of the World Bank, and they have their own list of vulnerabilities of their report. They list a kind of limitation of the subject. You'll see there are sometimes on some indicator there are more than 50 criteria. So it's not impossible that there are biases that some people try to change some. But I say, do not panic. The independence of the international organization is not really under threat. They have to face some situations, but it's not under threat. Thank you.
Thank you, Petru. I like how you ended this first intervention by saying, do not panic. So I really appreciate your answer to the question, should international organizations be independent vis-a-vis states? And you said yes, no, maybe, and kind of unpack that a little bit. I also really appreciate your kind of view behind the scenes from your personal experience working for the Joint Inspection Units and the reports you produced in that context. I think this is also something we can get back in the discussion. But before we do that, I would like to turn to Ambassador Mukerji with basically the same question. To what extent should international organizations, or how, not to what extent, sorry, I liked what extent question, but that was actually not my initial question. The initial question is, how much independence and freedom of maneuver should international organizations have in relation to states? And you noticed I snuck in this to what extent, which kind of possibly points to the direction of kind of unpacking this a bit more. But over to you for your reflections, also as a diplomat who has been to the heart of the multilateral system in New York.
Well, thank you, Kat, and I agree with Ambassador Petru that the international organizations that we look at are organizations composed of member states. So their independence can only be to the extent that the member states allow them to have a so-called independent role. I think that here the point about their effectiveness and their flexibility, room for maneuver, really goes into the nature of the international organization that you're looking at. And I'd like to take 3 examples. One is the United Nations, and Master Petru has spoken very, based on his experience, very clearly on the situation in the United Nations. It is a treaty-based organization. So member states have got obligations, they have got rights, and everything is codified in the treaty. And as has been pointed out, the Secretariat, led by the Secretary General, is expected to be independent under Article 100 of the UN Charter. And so in theory, this is the structure that we have. In practice, there have been from time to time concerns expressed about the independence of the United Nations, about about whether there's trust in the United Nations or not. And there have been examples over the years of this kind of concern. You remember the Oil for Food program, which dented the Secretary Generalship of Kofi Annan. That was a very vivid example, but there have been others as well. So one is an organization like the United Nations, which in which the answer is that the member states determine and decide how much independence and room for maneuver it has. A second kind of international organization outside the UN family is the World Trade Organization. Now, that is a contractual organization. So the independence of the World Trade Organization vis-a-vis its members is very jealously contested and fought over in terms of the contractual agreements between the members of the WTO. You have an independent profile of the Secretariat of the World Trade Organization, which produces very substantive inputs trying to push the agenda of the WTO agreement. And when the first attempts came in 1995, 96 of this Secretariat, I remember having been in the World Trade Organization at that time, how much concern there was from members of the governments who are members of the organization to limit the independence of the Secretariat. And now every report of the Secretariat of the World Trade Organization starts with the caveat that these are not the views of the members of the states of the WTO. These are the Secretariat's background papers. That's what they always call them. These are background papers. So they're not policy documents, they are background papers. And then there is a third kind of international organization, which I think for many of us, and I saw Vlada's comment in the chat as well, that is, I think, the way international organizations will probably need to evolve in the next, in this century. And that is the organization which is multiple stakeholder in nature. It's the organization like the International Labour Organization, ILO. It brings the governments, it brings the employers, and it brings the workers. And how do they function in terms of having room for maneuver, having an independence, and how do they? And I think that in each of these 3 examples, the core issue for me in answering this question that you put is decision making. How are decisions taken? Because the independence of the organization actually it plays into the way the organization functions, and that means how does the organization take decisions. And if you take the United Nations, for example, on the one hand, in Article 18, you have one country, one vote. So it's a very democratic organization. It decides by a consensus, if there's no consensus, by a majority vote or a 2/3 majority vote. And yet inside that organization, there's this anomaly of 5 countries dominating the United Nations political pillar. And as we have seen in the last decade or 2 decades, they impact not only the political pillar, but also the socioeconomic pillar and the human rights pillars. And therefore, how do we reconcile the independence of the United Nations in responding, say, to COVID, the pandemic, with an all of UN approach, when they are prevented from doing so by the lack of political agreement among the 5 permanent members for 2 months in 2020? They couldn't even adopt a resolution in the Security Council to support an all-of-UN approach to respond to this global pandemic, which affected every member state of the United Nations. So did that impact on the independence and the perception of independence of the United Nations? I think is a legitimate question to ask. In terms of the WTO, there is the other kind of problem that everything has to be on the basis of consensus. And very often that is now looked at as the main reason why the WTO is not able to perform independently or have room for maneuver. Everything is blocked even by one country. And therefore, is there a need for a way forward? And again, I come back to the third example I gave you, which is the ILO. And I think that when you look at the track record of the ILO from 1922 onwards, in its current incarnation, that is one organization which is an unsung international organization, but which probably contains the template for how international organizations in the 21st century would have to function to demonstrate their independence and their room for maneuver. And it will have to be fought in a more transparent way. And I think the transparency that you see in, for example, elections for the ILO leadership will have to be brought into elections in the United Nations, and the kind of opacity that prevails in a body like the Security Council. I mean, you cannot now go with this model into the 21st century, especially if you are dealing with the point which was made of multiple stakeholders. So I think that there is no reason to say that everything is stuck and can't be changed. I think it can be changed. I think even the United Nations General Assembly has agreed and adopted the way forward, which is to move through a multiple stakeholder approach. How much these stakeholders will gain or give in the process is another question. But I think that we cannot now expect that governments are the only ones who can decide how independent and how flexible international organizations will be. A lot will depend also on the other stakeholders. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you so much for this great outline and these very useful distinctions, basically reminding us we need to look at what organization we are specifically talking about, how decisions are made in that organization, and then that has implications for this discussion. I thought that was a really good reminder and really helpful for me to kind of structure my thoughts. Certainly. And then the kind of points about the question of trust. Is there trust in the work of international organizations? And you mentioned incidences where that has been questioned. I found that really, really useful. And in the chat, there's been quite some interesting discussion going on these questions, also related to the Secretary Generals of international organizations. I want to turn to my colleague, Andriana, to give us an impression of what has been going on in the chat, and to bring some of the questions we've seen there back into our discussion. Over to you, Andriana.
Thank you for the floor, Kath. Yes, it's been interesting in the chat. It blew up all of a sudden. We have a mixed comment and a question. Vladimir Radunovic is saying that one of the biggest concerns in the digital sphere for the next period is the upcoming election for the Secretary General of the ITU, as Russian and the US candidates are pitted against each other. Now, is this a hype? Is there no need to panic, whoever is elected? Or does this election in practice matter? And what would be the role of perception, even if the Secretary General does remain largely independent? And Ginger noted that the UN and the WTO are very linked to national sovereignty and national goals, and that we expect these to be tied to national positions. However, organizations whose goals transcend national interests, humanitarian and health, are also there. And we need clearer independence in favor of a common good. Is that possible? And Ginger also directed a question to Professor Dumitriu. Do these organizations fit under independent or under maybe in your framework? And a comment we've had from Malaysia is, to what extent is a good question to ask in reference to international organizations. For any organization to carry out its mandate, red lines must not be crossed in terms of rules and procedures. They are supposed to be independent, but they must operate within their jurisdiction. That will be all for now, Kat. I'm sure there will be more. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Just piggybacking on this last comment by Muleza, yeah, very much. This is, I think, very well put. But I wanna put this host of questions and comments we received so far back to our speakers. Perhaps starting with you, Petru. What are your initial comments and reactions to this?
I think all these questions, expect a sort of longer answer. I try to be short and at the same time meaningful. The elections of the chief executives is very important. So even if the Secretary General of the United Nations, according to the Charter, is the chief administrator of, so he is just primus inter pares, the first public servant in the United Nations. But still, it weighs a lot of symbolic power and moral authority. And I think even according to the Charter, the Secretary General has the prerogative to raise some issue and to present some issues and put them on the agenda of the United Nations. So in the case of specialized agencies, programs and funds, so the rest of the United Nations system, of course, the chief executive is very important because in particular in this agency, they will have more power in deciding the policies, in deciding the directions, in setting up the priorities. But again, all this is in a system of check and balances. There are mechanisms that, they always monitor, approve, take note, or reject the proposal of the Secretary General. We have so many examples in the past. For instance, let's take the program of reform of Kofi Annan during his first mandate. He had track 1 reform, which was within his own prerogative as Secretary General. So he had the power, according to the Charter, to do moves in the Secretariat, to reorganize departments, etc., etc. But there was the track 2 of the reform, which involved the agreement of the member states. So the chief executive can influence the policies, but to a limited extent. Politically speaking and symbolically speaking, who is elected, whether it's a Chinese or an American or a Brazilian, that is very important indeed for the symbolism. But in my personal opinion, once you are there on the top of the organizations, you have to follow the agenda of organization. You cannot follow any other external agenda, your own governments or other governments. The Ginger question about, I think my general remarks cover also this question, whether these two organizations are under yes, no, or maybe. I would say that the constitutions, the constitutive acts of these organizations provides enough mechanisms to have a sort of check and balances and not to allow abuses by any top executive. But at the same time, we do not have to ignore facts like the fact that Boutros Ghali was stopped to get the second mandate. It was stopped to get the second mandate just because one country with a veto power did not want Boutros Ghali to continue. So it happens. But again, this comes to no surprise. Why? Because when one country joined the United Nations, accepts the Charter, accepts the prerogative of the Security Council, and another point which has to be taken into account is in terms of realpolitik. There is no interest in a Secretary General or the top executive to fight against influential member states. That won't be for the good of the organization. So the chief executive have to cooperate and to find a compromise and to convince the member states to follow some policies or priorities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these reflections. I want to hand it right over to Ambassador Mukerji. Ashok, what are your reactions also to what Petru just said?
Yeah, well, I think that, what Ambassador Petru has said is right. And the question that was asked about the elections of the chief executive of these organizations is on one level symbolically very important. And of course, in the United Nations system, we have seen attempts to say that they are spreading this chief executive post between different geographic regions. But then in 2016, when Mr. Guterres was brought in, they bypassed one geographic region and brought in the same kind of. They went back just to the Western European group. So there are exceptions which are made, but in theory, there is an attempt to be democratic in the kind of person who will become the head of chief executive of the organization. But I think one of the dimensions in the answer to this question that has been asked is, what does the chief executive actually do? And I think Ambassador Petru put it very well. He cannot go against the most powerful and resourceful members of the organization. That is very true. But at the same time, I think the chief executive of the organization actually can do three things. One is that person can determine and monitor the implementation of the work of the organization. I think that's an important role. And there are priorities which that executive can give, to which area of the work of the organization should more resources be given, to which area should more personnel be given. After all, in the United Nations system, there are 36,000 personnel, and they're all under the Secretary General. So where will these people be allotted and how will they work? I think that is one very important function which affects the impact on the ground of the United Nations, for example. The second area is in the decision of the chief executive to bring to the attention of the member states issues. And I think that this is something that is, for the last 30 years, there's one issue which has haunted a lot of member states in the United Nations, and that's linked with genocide. I mean, from the Rwanda genocide onwards, there has been this issue of why has this not been brought in time? And I mean, if I go back in time, even in 1971, when U Thant was in his last year as the Secretary General, he never brought the genocide of what was happening in South Asia to the Security Council in the way that he could have. Because you have a convention on genocide, you have obligations of member states, et cetera, et cetera. But so the Secretary General, therefore, can be accused of acts of commission as well as of omission. But there's a third element, and that's linked with the question that Vlada asked about the ITU, and that is the role of the chief executive in actually setting standards and norms. And in technical organizations, I think that is a very important function. Which has an impact beyond just the member states as governments. It also has an impact on the different stakeholders within those states as well as in the global community as such. And I think that in the International Telecommunications Union, this is a very interesting crossroad that we have reached now, with the United States showing interest in the ITU, because I have been a part of the ITU work when I was in the government. And I remember the Dubai conference in 2012 of the ITU, and we all bent over backwards, literally, to accommodate the United States and its stakeholders, to get them to agree that the ITU will continue to respond to the new realities brought by information and communication technologies. And at the last hour, I mean, literally at 12 o'clock at night, the United States walked out of the Dubai conference of the ITU, leaving it absolutely up in the air. So what was the impact on all the other member states who actually cooperated to make the ITU relevant for the 21st century? And now, 10 years later, we are back at the same point. And I do hope that this time there will be some forward-looking movement, because the experience of the last 10 years has shown that you do need international cooperation, preferably through the ITU, and preferably through a chief executive who understands the issues that are involved. And as Ambassador Petru says, there are powerful interests, there are powerful member states, the United States and China. They will be sparring over the standards, the technical details that will be dealt with in the ITU. But that is the job that is also that is the job profile. So whoever wants to be elected or selected as the chief executive of the ITU has to be aware that after being elected, as Ambassador Petru says, you have to belong to the entire organization and not only follow your own agenda. So thanks. That's what I'd like to say.
Thank you. I think this is really enlightening, and I think we covered that question of will the role of the future Secretary General of the ITU, and the question, will it matter whether or not that person comes from the US or from Russia, quite extensively, which was a really interesting discussion to unpack this a bit and to kind of shed a bit more light there. We are almost out of time for our discussion, so we have about 10 minutes left. And I want to kind of probe you a bit more to some extent. Not to some extent, we all agree that international organizations need to be protected from the undue influence of member states. We agree that member states are the backbone of international organizations, but there's something, there's an element of undue influence that international organizations need to be protected against. So given both of your experience and all the reflections you shared so far, I would basically like to ask you what can be done, or what should be done in the future to kind of shield international organizations from this undue influence, given their dependence on states in terms of the budget, in terms of political will and support. So can you give us some suggestions, or maybe even a checklist, how we can start thinking in that direction? I would like to start with Petru for some initial reflections on that important question.
But partly I would respond to that question, taking also the last point raised by Vlada about the finances. So due or undue, this is again a matter of interpretation, like everything in a subjective world and political world as it is ours. For instance, and I have some figures, listen carefully my figures. So United Nations has 193 member states. So practically, if we divide the assessed contribution equally to all these member states, we should, it means that all countries should pay like 107% of the scale of assessment. Okay. Actually, 18 members, the most developed countries, they pay 82% of the budget. Is that fair? It is fair from the point of view of those who don't want to pay. So these countries, these 18 countries, reflect the world we live in, a world that is polarized. You know, the differences between developed and least developed countries. And you'll say, okay, that is the tyranny of the rich. Well, I would dare to say that it is not, because at the same time, there are 88 member states who only pay 0.36 of the budget. So 88 member states, as Ambassador Mukerji said, they have one vote equal with the vote of the top 10 contributors, top 18 contributors. So Greece only pays more than 88 countries altogether. Is that fair? Is that undue? So I would interpret that in a positive register, in the sense that there is indeed, you know, the financial power. Without the contribution of this rich country, we won't have the organizations. But at the same time, given the voting power in terms of numbers in the General Assembly, the poor countries, the least developed countries, they can put together majorities and reverse some decisions that might be wanted by the big powers. And that happens all the time. Let's take, for instance, the resolution on Middle East. The United States will be always outnumbered by the votes of the General Assembly. I'm not talking about the Security Council, but even in the Security Council, the P5 can decide to mount an operation somewhere. Okay, but they won't be able, without the support of the troop contributors, to have this operation in place. So there is, I would say that there is a sort of inbuilt attempt to have a balance. This does not work always, and have many examples. We don't have time to review them, but I think again there is a need of compromise. And last point, what Ginger asked about the priority of global common goods. Okay, that is the priority, provided that the definition of this, what is global common goods, what is public goods, is agreed again by a majority of member states. And very important, just one really last point on what Ambassador Mukerji said about the multi-stakeholders. This is the tendency toward this third United Nations, the one in which the rest of the world, the non-state actors are involved. And I think indeed, since the World Summit on the Information Society, the United Nations system evolves towards a multi-stakeholder pattern of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the response. Because of time, I want to head straight over to Ambassador Mukerji, to Asoke. Again, this question: how do we protect international organizations from undue influence of states? And the budget questions that Petru just spoke about certainly factor into these concerns, as Vlada was also mentioning in the chat.
Yeah, well, I think that it's a fair point which Ambassador Petru has talked about. That some countries give more and most countries give less. But I think there are two things that happen on the ground, and I think it's important to take that into account. The first is, and that's been our experience in what we call the Global South, is that a lot of the money that is sent through the United Nations into the field is actually taken back by the countries which give the money. I'll give you an example. For peacekeeping, the troops that are contributed mainly by developing countries get $1,700 a month. A humanitarian peacekeeper, who's invariably from a Western, highly developed country, gets $4,000 a month for the same place. And that is not equitable. I mean, that is a point. I think that, that needs to be taken into account. The second is that in terms of the scale of assessments and why these countries are paying less and some countries are paying more, and how much influence there is of the countries who pay more, I think that when the institutions were created, and including the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, there was a colonial world. I mean, we didn't have decolonization in 1944 and 1945. Today, there is a completely different world, 193 states as been referred to. And a lot of these states were part of the colonial possession. So there is a process which is underway of seeking equity or seeking justice. Some would call it seeking reparations. But that process is very much a process that drives this large group of 134 countries, the G77, which feel that they don't have to put as much money on the table as the others who have colonized them in the past have to. Now that is going to change. Multiple stakeholderism has come. There are corporates which have come in. They will bring their own financial resources and try and influence. After all, why does the Gates Foundation have to use the WHO for its work in the field? It is because the WHO is a brand. It's a UN brand, a specialized agency. It gives that much more acceptance, and that creates that much bigger market for the Gates Foundation. So I think that is a point that needs to be also taken into account, that it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. And in each market of the Global South, the UN is a very big brand. And I think that as we go into this century, we'll see states and non-states, to answer your question, trying to leverage the UN brand for their own purposes. Thanks.
What you just said really chimes well with one of the questions we have in the chat, which is the very final question for this debate, which I would like Andriana to bring into the discussion.
Thank you for the floor, Kath. What happened in the chat since my last intervention is, well, there was Lada's question, how can we even reduce the impact that finances can have on independence? And our speakers already addressed this, picking up the question from the chat. Ginger said there's a very interesting parallel in independence, very practically and clearly linking economic power as well as political power. And she said the big question is this fair, and does that matter? And Johan asked an interesting question. What will be the UN Secretary General's response to Elon Musk's call to explain how would the UN solve the world hunger problem and how he would finance it with billions? He would like the panelists, if they have any views on this particular question, to let us know. And that will be it from me, Kath. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you on this Elon Musk question. So the way I understand it, he's ready to put billions into solving world hunger if the UN can basically provide the how to do that. Very, very provocative, which chimes really well with what Ambassador Mukerji mentioned at the end, kind of non-state actors, the business sector becoming more and more relevant. With all of this in mind, perhaps very quick final reflections from each of you on the debate we had today, perhaps on further questions that come from this debate. And Petru, would you like to start very briefly, perhaps even in the form of a tweet, if you can?
Well, in the form of the tweet, I will respond to Jovan's question because it's very specific. I think for the United Nations, I don't want to be cynical or too realpolitik oriented, but money has no odor. So I think if there are contributions from Elon Musk and other eccentric guys, rich guys, who actually do not deserve their fortune, I think it's good to put their money on use, and the United Nations has the know-how to use that money for humanitarian and other noble purposes.
Thank you. And the final word, Ambassador Mukerji, Ashok, over to you.
Well, I won't give the final word. I'll just give the way forward for another discussion, perhaps. And that is that, resources and objectives, there's always a gap between the objectives we set for ourselves and the resources available. And I think that whether it's Elon Musk or other people like him who want to contribute to meeting the objectives, these resources will be always welcome because they will bridge a huge gap which exists between the aspiration and the reality. But having said that, I think it's important also to understand why these people are giving the resources and what are the obligations they will take in response to accepting their resources, because it's not a one-way street that they will get access to everything that the UN does and they will give nothing in return. And I think that that's an important point which probably needs another discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much for also paving the way for future discussions. And speaking of that, what I also wanted to mention at the end of this discussion, both Ambassador Mukerji and Ambassador Dumitriu are key members of our faculty at Diplo and are highly involved, very involved in delivering our online courses, our training, our capacity development. I had the pleasure to work alongside both of them in delivering courses, in the case of Petru, multilateral diplomacy, in the case of Ashok, diplomatic theory and practice. This brings me to the point that applications for one of these courses, diplomatic theory and practice, are now open. The course will start in February. My colleague will put the link to that in the chat. So if some of the points we raised in this discussion were really interesting to you, this might be a way to follow up and deepen the discussion with our experts. I would also like to mention Petru's course, which is multilateral diplomacy. Applications for that will open in spring and the course will start in May. Again, another chance to hear from our experts and to deepen the discussion. With having said that, I would really like to thank our speakers for joining us today and for a really interesting and frank discussion with some key points and some highlights for me, really, in terms of the frankness and direct answers to some of the questions we had. Let me also thank you, our audience, for joining us and for the questions and comments here in the chat. We will be back next week, next month, with a new topic. But for now, thank you so much, Ambassador Mukerji, Ambassador Dumitriu. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It has been really nice to be part of this debate. Thank you very much, Kat, for a very good moderation.
Recording stopped.